The widowed millionaire gave up on Christmas until the cleaner's baby appeared. He lived surrounded by luxury but empty of meaning. The child's unexpected presence exposed wounds money had never healed, and what he did next shocked everyone around him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, on with the story. The clock on the living room wall read 3 in the morning when Michael opened his eyes again. Sleep was impossible in this room that was too big, too quiet, too empty. The curtains had remained drawn for months, blocking any sliver of natural light that dared to invade this sanctuary of shadows. He got up, his bare feet on the cold hardwood floor, and walked to the window without really seeing the path. His feet knew every step, every corner, every piece of furniture in this Upper West Side brownstone, like someone navigating a map etched into their soul. Outside, New York City breathed its nocturnal rhythm. Occasional cars sliced through Columbus Avenue, distant sirens echoed between the high-rises, and the city that never sleeps continued its relentless cycle. But inside that house, time had stopped exactly 362 days ago. Michael knew. He counted each one like a man serving a life sentence. Helen had passed on a December morning the year before. The word everyone used was gentle, almost poetic, as if she had simply chosen to go to a better place. But Michael knew the raw truth behind the euphemisms. His partner of 15 years, the woman who had turned this house into a home, who had filled every room with laughter and music and life, was no longer there. And with her absence, everything had lost its color, its shape, its purpose. The first few months were a dense fog of empty condolences and hugs from people who didn't know what to say. Michael accepted it all with the same distant expression, as if watching his own life from afar through a frosted window. Then came the silences, the calls that stopped coming, the friends who gave up trying, and finally, the absolute solitude that he himself cultivated as the only tolerable company. The company he and Helen had built together was still running, now managed by partners Michael barely recognized. He signed documents when necessary, attended virtual meetings with his camera off, and kept up the bare minimum of appearances. The money kept coming in, the bills were paid, the house was maintained by a staff he avoided seeing. Everything ran on autopilot while Michael existed, only as a shadow of his former self. Mrs. Carmen, the house manager Helen had hired years ago, kept the house in order with an iron fist. A woman in her 60s, with her hair in a tight bun and a permanently severe expression, she commanded the other staff with military efficiency. Michael barely interacted with her. He signed the monthly checks, approved hires when requested, and maintained the safe distance of someone who didn't want to form ties with anyone else. It was Mrs. Carmen who had hired Julia 3 months ago, when the previous cleaning lady quit. Michael only knew about it because he had to sign the employment paperwork. He didn't know the new employee's face, didn't know her full name, and didn't care to know. She came in through the back of the house on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, cleaned the rooms he didn't use, and left before they ever had to cross paths. What Michael didn't know was that Julia arrived at that house every day at 5:30 in the morning, coming from the Bronx on a packed bus that took almost 2 hours. He didn't know that she brought her young daughter with her because she had no one to leave the girl with. He didn't know that Julia worked with her heart, torn between gratitude for the job and the constant fear of losing this sole source of income. Julia was 28 and carried on her shoulders the weight of a lifetime of choices that were never really choices. She got pregnant at 19 by a man who promised to stay and disappeared before the baby was even born. She raised Sophia alone with the help of her maternal grandmother, who passed away when the girl turned 5. Since then it was just the two of them against a world that made nothing easy for single mothers without a college degree, without a support system, without any room for error. The apartment where they lived in the Bronx was small, damp, and noisy. It was in an old building in Mott Haven near the train tracks, where the sound of the cars cut through the night every 15 minutes. Julia worked at 3 different houses throughout the week, cleaning, ironing, cooking, doing whatever was necessary to cover the rent, food, and Sophia's school supplies. The girl was 8 years old and had eyes too big for her age, eyes that saw things no child should have to see. The exhaustion on her mother's face when they got home at 9 at night The bills spread across the table, sorted into piles of what could wait and what couldn't. The silent nightmares Julia sometimes had, waking up startled in the middle of the night, covering her face with her hands so she wouldn't cry out loud. Sophia learned early on to be quiet, not to ask for too much, to be invisible when necessary. At school she was the quiet student the teachers praised for being well-behaved. At home she was the companion Julia never asked for, but was thankful for every day. And in the houses where her mother worked, Sophia became an even more discreet shadow, sitting in a corner with a book borrowed from the library, patiently waiting for the day to end. The brownstone on the Upper West Side was the place that scared Sophia the most. Not because of the building itself, which was beautiful and spacious, with well-tended gardens and rooms that looked like they were out of a magazine. What was scary was the silence. Heavy, dense, almost palpable silence, as if the entire house were in mourning. And there was Mrs. Carman, who looked at Julia and Sophia with a mixture of forced tolerance and poorly disguised disapproval. From the very first day, Mrs. Carman made the rules clear. Julia was to enter through the back, never the front door. She was to use the service bathroom, never the powder rooms. She was to keep her daughter quiet, invisible, and away from any area where the boss might eventually appear. And above all, she was to work with maximum efficiency, because Mrs. Carman did not tolerate mistakes, tardiness, or excuses. Julia accepted it all without question. She needed this job. The pay was better than at the other houses, and Mrs. Carman, despite her rigidity, paid on time and kept her on the books. She couldn't afford to complain, to question, to take risks. So she lowered her head, cleaned each room with extra care, and was inwardly grateful to have a place to work. Sophia, for her part, observed everything with the sharp perception that only very sensitive children develop. She noticed how her mother's shoulders slumped when Mrs. Carman approached. She saw the tremor in Julia's hands when a task was criticized. She felt the constant fear that hung over them, invisible but omnipresent, like a threat that could materialize at any moment. December arrived, bringing with it the biting cold of a New York winter. The streets filled with holiday decorations, colorful lights hanging from every corner, festive music playing in stores and malls. The entire city transformed into a forced celebration of joy, while Michael felt the opposite. Every decoration, every song, every TV commercial was a knife twisting in the still open wound. It had been exactly 1 year since Helen had passed. And December, which used to be her favorite month, was now unbearable. Michael started leaving the house at night, walking aimlessly through the streets of the Upper West Side, fleeing the memories that the walls of the house insisted on projecting. He wore an old baseball cap, dark clothes, and sat on park benches watching the city's movement like someone watching a movie without subtitles. It was on one of those nights, in a small, tree-lined square off Amsterdam Avenue, that Michael was sitting when life decided to intervene unexpectedly. It was a Thursday, around 8 in the evening. The square was relatively empty, just a few residents walking their dogs and couples talking quietly on other benches. Michael had been there for almost an hour, lost in circular thoughts about Helen, about the empty house, about the emptiness inside him, when he noticed a small presence approaching. He looked up and saw a girl of maybe 8 or 9, with brown hair in 2 braids, wearing a simple dress and worn-out sandals. She was looking at him with an expression that was neither curiosity nor fear. It was something deeper, recognition perhaps. Michael froze, not knowing how to react. He hadn't spoken to children in years. He hadn't spoken to almost anyone, for that matter. But the girl didn't seem to be waiting for words. She simply sat down next to him on the bench, keeping a respectful distance, and stayed there, looking straight ahead at the trees illuminated by the park's lampposts. The minutes passed in silence, a different kind of silence than what Michael was used to. It wasn't the heavy silence of the empty house or the deafening silence of loneliness. It was a shared, almost comfortable silence, as if the girl understood that he didn't need conversation, just company. After a time that could have been 5 minutes or half an hour, Michael heard a woman's voice calling. It was a young woman, visibly worried, approaching the square quickly. The girl stood up, gave Michael a small wave, and ran back to her mother. Julia took her daughter by the hand, murmured something he couldn't hear, and the two disappeared around the corner. Michael was left there, alone again, but with a strange feeling in his chest. Something had shifted in those silent minutes. He didn't know what, couldn't name it, but it was as if a small crack had opened in the wall he had built around himself. The next morning, a Friday, Michael woke up earlier than usual, not by choice, but because sleep simply wouldn't come. He went down the stairs to the kitchen, something he hadn't done in months, and found Mrs. Carman making coffee. She seemed genuinely surprised to see him. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. I wasn't expecting you up this early." Michael just nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee that Mrs. Carman hurried to provide. It was then that he heard quiet voices coming from the back of the house. Female voices, one adult and one child. Mrs. Carman noticed Michael's gaze in the direction of the sound and rushed to explain. "That's Julia, sir, the cleaner who works Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. She brings her daughter along because she has no one to leave the girl with. I hope it's not a problem. I assure you the child is no trouble at all." Michael didn't answer. He walked to the window overlooking the backyard and watched. Julia was organizing cleaning supplies while the girl sat on a small bench against the wall, flipping through a book. It was the same girl from the park. The recognition was instant and mutual. Sophia looked up from her book and met Michael's gaze through the window. For a second, the two just looked at each other. Then the girl gave a small, discreet but genuine smile before turning her attention back to the book. Something stirred inside Michael, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a whole year. It wasn't joy, definitely not. But it also wasn't the paralyzing pain that had been with him since Helen passed. It was something new, undefined and disturbing in its own way. Julia, who hadn't noticed the exchange of glances, continued working with her usual nervous efficiency. She knew Mrs. Carman was constantly watching her, looking for mistakes, testing her limits. She couldn't afford to fail. What Julia didn't know was that her life was about to get complicated in ways she could never have predicted. Because that very afternoon, when she finished her work at the brownstone and went to get Sophia from the makeshift room in the back, she would find someone waiting on the sidewalk in front of the gate, someone from the past, someone she had spent the last 9 years trying to forget and avoid. Bruno was there, leaning against an old motorcycle, smoking a cigarette and smiling in that way that used to make Julia tremble. Not with pleasure, but with fear. He had changed little in the years that had passed. He still had the same calculating eyes, the same arrogant posture of someone who believes the world owes them something. When Julia came out of the back gate with Sophia by the hand, her stomach churned at the sight of him. She tried to walk a different way, but Bruno stepped into their path, flicking his cigarette to the ground and stomping on it with unnecessary force. "Hey, Jules, long time no see, huh? And this must be Sophia. Wow, she's gotten so big." Julia pulled her daughter closer, feeling the small body tremble against her leg. Sophia didn't know this man, but a child's instincts are sharp. She knew this presence was not a good one. "What do you want, Bruno?" Julia's voice came out firmer than she expected, but her hands were visibly shaking. Bruno's smile widened as he took a step forward. They instinctively stepped back. "Just visiting. I'm her father, after all. I have rights, you know." Julia's heart pounded. For 9 years, Bruno had never shown the slightest interest in Sophia. He never paid a dime in child support, never asked if his daughter was okay, never even wanted to see her. And now he was showing up out of nowhere talking about rights. "You abandoned her before she was even born. You have no rights." Bruno shrugged, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "A judge might think differently, Jules, but look, it doesn't have to be like this. We can talk, come to an agreement, a little financial support now and then maybe, and I won't have to complicate your life." There it was, the thinly veiled blackmail. Julia knew men like Bruno. She knew the game, the manipulation, the veiled threats, and she knew he wasn't there out of paternal love or remorse. He was there because he saw an opportunity. "I don't have any money to give you." Bruno looked at the huge house behind her, at the wrought iron gate, at the high, well-kept walls. "Doesn't look like it. Working in a house like this, you must make good money, and even if you don't, your bosses do. I'm sure you can figure something out." Julia felt anger boil inside her, but also the icy fear that paralyzed her. If Bruno really decided to file for custody of Sophia, she would have to face legal proceedings, lawyers, costs she could never afford. And even knowing that a judge would likely side with her, the mere risk of losing her daughter was enough to destroy her. "I have to go." Julia tried to pass, but Bruno blocked her path once more. "Think about what I said, Jules. I'm not leaving. I'll be around waiting. And, hey, it would be a shame if your bosses found out you bring your kid to work without permission, wouldn't it? Could cause problems." He finally moved away, getting on his motorcycle and starting the engine with a loud roar that made Sophia flinch even more. Before leaving, Bruno turned one last time. "I'll see you soon, Jules. You can count on it." And then he was gone, leaving Julia standing on the sidewalk with her legs shaking and her heart racing. Sophia tugged on her mother's hand, looking up with those big frightened eyes. "Who was that man, Mummy?" Julia swallowed hard, trying to find words that would protect her daughter without completely lying. "Nobody important, sweetie. Let's go home." But as they walked to the bus stop, Julia knew she had lied. Bruno was important. Important like a threat, like a real danger that now hung over their lives like a dark cloud about to burst. Inside the silent brownstone, Michael was sitting in his second-floor office, looking at the security monitor screens he never used, but which were still running. There were cameras at various external points of the property, installed years ago when Helen had insisted on beefing up security. Without knowing exactly why, Michael had accessed the afternoon's recordings and watched the scene at the back gate. He saw Julia leaving with the girl. He saw the man approaching. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told the story. The way Julia pulled her daughter close, how she backed away, how she tried to leave and was blocked. Michael rewound and watched it again and again. There was something about that scene that bothered him deeply, something that resonated with a part of him he thought was completely dead. It was fear, the fear in Julia's eyes, the fear in Sophia's small body huddled against her mother, the same kind of fear Helen used to fight so fiercely whenever she witnessed injustice. Michael turned off the monitor and sat there in the dark office, listening only to the silence of the house. For the first time in 362 days, he thought about something other than Helen or his own pain. He thought about two strangers he didn't know. He thought about the girl who had sat next to him in the park without saying a word. He thought about the simple, pure, expectation-free gesture. And he thought that maybe, after so long of just existing, it was time to start living again, even if he didn't know how to do it yet. Outside, Christmas lights began to switch on in the neighboring houses. New York was preparing for another celebration, while Michael remained sitting in the dark, making a decision that would change more lives than he could possibly imagine at that moment. Sometimes living isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering differently. It's about transforming pain into something that protects others from the same pain. It's about honoring the one who left not through eternal suffering, but through actions that person would have approved of. And Helen, wherever she was, would certainly approve of what Michael was about to do. The following days brought a routine heavy with tension for Julia. Bruno started showing up frequently near the Upper West Side house, always at different times, always with that calculating smile that made her stomach turn. Sometimes he was on the corner when she arrived in the morning. Other times he'd appear in the late afternoon as she was leaving. He never got too close, never did. Anything that could be reported, but his presence was a constant, silent threat. Julia tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the fear was eating away at her ability to function. She started making small mistakes at work. She broke a porcelain cup while washing dishes. She forgot to clean the master bathroom. She used the wrong temperature on the iron and left a faint yellow mark on a white shirt. Mrs. Carmen didn't let anything slide. Every mistake was met with a reprimand. With every reprimand, Julia shrank a little more. Sophia noticed everything, watching with those big, frightened eyes as her mother slowly unraveled, as if she were disappearing from the inside out. In the neighboring brownstone, an equally large home, lived a family that Mrs. Carmen occasionally visited. It was during one of these visits that the house manager commented to her colleague about the recent problems with Julia. The news, as it always does in small circles, spread. Other domestic workers in the area began to talk about the employee who was failing, who might soon be fired. Julia knew nothing of this. She was too busy trying to survive each day, trying to protect. Sophia trying to figure out a way to make Bruno disappear without money for lawyers or the courage to confront him directly. Michael, for his part, continued his routine of silent observation. Not out of voyeurism or morbid curiosity, but because something about the situation had hooked him in a way he couldn't explain. He started reviewing the security camera footage every night, watching Julia and Sophia's movements, and especially observing the increasingly frequent appearances of the man on the motorcycle. There was a pattern. The guy would show up, Julia would become visibly tense, they would exchange a few words, and he would leave. But with each encounter he stayed a little longer. With each encounter he got a little closer. Michael recognized the signs. It was escalation, gradual intimidation, a progressive increase in pressure until the victim caved. It was on a Tuesday, during one of the rare conversations he had with Mrs. Carman, that Michael decided to ask directly, "Is Julia having some kind of problem?" Mrs. Carman seemed surprised by the question. The boss rarely showed interest in the staff. "She's been a bit distracted lately, sir, making mistakes she didn't used to make. I've spoken with her several times, but I don't see any improvement." "Did she say why?" "No, sir. But if this continues, I'll have to consider other options. I can't allow the standard of work to drop." Michael nodded, but internally, something rebelled against the idea. Firing Julia would mean throwing her directly into the arms of the predator who was circling her. And it would mean taking Sophia away from there, the girl who had sat next to him in the park and shared that moment of silence that inexplicably had begun to crumble the walls he had built around himself. "Give me some more time with her. I'll keep an eye on the situation." Mrs. Carman agreed, though visibly confused. She had never seen the boss show this kind of interest in domestic matters, but she had been an employee long enough to know when not to ask questions. That same evening, Michael went out for his usual walk. It had become almost a ritual. Leave at 8, walk aimlessly through the Upper West Side, sit on the same bench in the square off Amsterdam Avenue, and stay there for an hour or two watching life happen around him. But that night, when he reached his usual bench, he found Sophia already sitting there alone. Michael's heart skipped a beat. An 8-year-old child alone in a park at night was not normal. He looked around for Julia and found her a few feet away, sitting on another bench, her face buried in her hands. Michael approached slowly, quietly, and sat down next to Sophia. The girl didn't seem surprised. She looked at him with those eyes that were too old for her age and gave a small, sad smile. "My mummy's crying." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Michael looked toward Julia, saw her shoulders shaking slightly. She was indeed crying, trying to hide it, trying to be strong, but crumbling under the weight of it all. "Do you know why?" Sophia shook her head no, but Michael could tell the girl knew more than she was letting on. Children always know. They pick up on the tensions, the unspoken fears, the threats that hang in the air like invisible smoke. "That man who came to talk to her the other day, he's mean, isn't he?" The question caught Michael off guard. Sophia didn't wait for an answer. She continued to look straight ahead, swinging her legs that didn't reach the ground. "My mummy gets different when he shows up. She gets scared. I get scared too." Michael felt something tighten in his chest. Anger, maybe. Or the distant memory of moral indignation he used to feel before he shut himself off from the world. Helen hated injustice. She hated people who used power to hurt the weak. And now, sitting there next to this child who shouldn't have to deal with this kind of fear, Michael wondered what Helen would do in this situation. The answer came as clear as crystal. Helen wouldn't just watch, she would act. Michael stood up and walked over to where Julia was sitting. She looked up, startled, when she noticed someone approaching, and the startle turned to pure panic when she recognized him. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry, we were just leaving." She stood up quickly, wiping her face with her hands, trying to hide any evidence of tears. But it was useless. Her eyes were red and swollen, her voice trembling. "Sit down." The command was gentle but firm. Julia hesitated, then obeyed, perching on the edge of the bench as if ready to run at any moment. Michael remained standing, watching her for a moment before speaking. "I've seen the man who's been approaching you in front of the house. I've seen him several times, actually, on the security cameras." Julia turned pale. The blood drained completely from her face. "Sir, I can explain. He just showed up out of nowhere. I didn't call him, I swear." Michael held up a hand, stopping the desperate flow of words. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking who he is and what he wants." Julia was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was broken. "He's Sophia's father. He left when I was pregnant. He never wanted anything to do with her, never helped with anything. And now he's shown up out of the blue, saying he has rights, that he can file for custody if I don't give him money. Blackmail." The word left Michael's mouth with the weight of a diagnosis. Julia nodded, tears now streaming freely. "I don't have any money. I can barely pay rent and buy food. I can't lose my job, sir. Please, I know I've been making mistakes, but I can't sleep. I can't think straight. He keeps waiting for me, following me, threatening me. And I'm so scared of losing Sophia. She's all I have." Her voice broke completely on the last sentence. Michael looked over to where Sophia was still sitting on the other bench, too small, too quiet, too scared. And then he looked at Julia, this woman who was falling apart trying to hold everything together, without help, without support, without hope, and he made a decision. "You're not going to lose her, and he's not going to keep threatening you." Julia looked up, confused and filled with desperate hope. "How? I can't afford a lawyer. I can't." "I can." The two words hung in the air between them. Julia blinked, trying to process what she was hearing. "Sir?" Michael finally sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. "I have the resources, I have access to good lawyers, and I have the camera footage of him threatening you repeatedly. That's enough to start the process for a restraining order. I can also look into his situation, see if there's anything that can be used to make him back off. But why would you do this for me? I'm just an employee." Michael was silent for a moment, searching for words. "Because no one should have to go through this alone. And because your daughter reminded me that there are still things in this world worth protecting." It was the most honest answer he could give without venturing into emotional territory that was still too dangerous to navigate. Julia started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief, of hope, of a gratitude so deep it couldn't be put into words. "Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me. You just need to keep taking care of your daughter and trust me to handle this." In the days that followed, Michael acted with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years building companies and solving complex problems. He contacted Richard Miller, a family law attorney who had worked for his company years ago. Richard was known for handling difficult cases involving psychological abuse, custody, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The meeting took place at Richard's office in a commercial building on Park Avenue. Michael brought flash drives with the recordings of all of Bruno's appearances, notes on the dates and times, and a detailed account Julia had written about the history of their relationship. Richard watched the videos in silence, taking notes. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers on the desk. "We have a solid case for an emergency restraining order. His behavior clearly constitutes harassment and threats, and considering he never legally acknowledged paternity, never paid child support and is only showing up now with obvious extortionist intentions, no judge is going to take a custody claim from him seriously. And if he pushes it anyway," Richard smiled reassuringly, "then we'll document everything, prepare Julia for any potential hearings, and make sure he understands that any move against her or the child will be met with every available legal resource. Usually when people like this realize they've met real resistance, they back down. They look for easy targets, not prolonged fights." "How long will it take?" "For the restraining order, we can get it in a matter of days. To completely resolve the situation, maybe a few weeks, but I can assure you, From the moment he's officially served, he'll think twice before coming near them. Michael nodded, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. He was doing something that mattered. He was using his resources for something more than just existing. While Michael mobilized legal resources, the situation inside the house was worsening in other ways. Mrs. Carmen, always attentive to her boss's movements, noticed the special attention he was giving Julia, and she didn't like it. The house manager had worked in that house for over 10 years. She had known Helen, witnessed the creation of their home, and experienced the grief after her passing. And during all that time, she had established a clear hierarchy where she was at the top of the domestic command chain. She didn't like it when that order was challenged. Julia was a threat. Not because of ambition. Mrs. Carmen knew the young woman had no ulterior motives, but because of vulnerability. Vulnerability attracted protection, and protection generated closeness. And Mrs. Carmen couldn't allow anyone to get too close to the boss, to occupy emotional space, to change the dynamic she had controlled for so long. So she began a subtle campaign of sabotage. She assigned Julia tasks that were impossible to complete in the allotted time. She changed instructions mid-task and then accused her of not following orders. She criticized her in front of the other staff. She created an environment of constant tension where Julia could do no right no matter how hard she tried. Sophia saw it all. She saw how Mrs. Carmen looked at her mother with barely concealed contempt. She heard the acidic comments, the unfair criticisms, and she began to develop a deep fear of this woman, with the tight bun and cold eyes. One afternoon as Julia was cleaning the upstairs bedrooms, Mrs. Carmen appeared with a new list of tasks. "When you're done here, I want you to reorganize the entire pantry. It's a mess." Julia glanced at the clock. She had an hour left in her shift. "Mrs. Carmen, that will take at least 3 hours. I have to pick Sophia up from school at 6. Then you should have started earlier. The pantry is unacceptable, and it's your responsibility." "But I didn't know I needed to do it today. You hadn't told me." Mrs. Carmen's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my orders? Because if you think you have special privileges just because the boss talked to you once, you are sorely mistaken. Inside this house, I'm in charge, and if you don't like it, the door is open." Julia felt tears burn in her eyes, but she held them back. She wouldn't give Mrs. Carmen the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "I'll do the pantry." Mrs. Carmen smiled, victorious, and left. Julia stood there, shaking with anger and frustration. She took out her phone and texted a neighbor who sometimes helped, asking her to pick Sophia up from school. Then she went down to the kitchen and began the impossible task. She was in the middle of her work when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned and found Michael standing in the pantry doorway. He rarely came to this part of the house. "Mrs. Carmen said you'll be working late today." It wasn't a question, but Julia answered anyway. "Yes, sir. She asked me to reorganize the pantry." Michael looked around. The pantry was perfectly organized. He looked back at Julia with clear understanding in his eyes. "Leave it. Go get your daughter." "But Mrs. Carmen said—" "I'm telling you to leave it. I'll speak with her." Julia hesitated, torn between the fear of disobeying the house manager and the relief of being able to leave. Relief won. "Thank you, sir." She left quickly before Mrs. Carmen could appear and complicate things. Michael stood there, looking at the pantry that needed no reorganization, and felt anger grow inside him. He found Mrs. Carmen in the living room, supervising another employee who was cleaning the windows. "I need to speak with you." His tone made the other employee discreetly exit. Mrs. Carmen turned, maintaining her erect professional posture. "Yes, sir?" "Why did you assign an unnecessary task to Julia knowing she needed to pick up her daughter?" Mrs. Carmen was unfazed. "The pantry needed reorganizing, sir. It's part of her job. The pantry is perfectly organized, and you know it." A tense silence filled the space between them. Mrs. Carmen lifted her chin, defiant. "Sir, with all due respect, I have managed this house for over 10 years. I have always kept everything running perfectly, even when you wanted nothing to do with it. And now, suddenly, you're questioning my methods because of an employee who's only been here for 3 months." Michael took a step forward, and for the first time in a year, There was real life in his eyes. Anger, determination, something Mrs. Carman hadn't seen since before Helen passed. "I'm questioning them because your methods are wrong. Julia is going through a difficult situation, and instead of showing compassion, you're sabotaging her work. That ends now." Mrs. Carman opened her mouth to respond, but Michael wasn't finished. "And just to be clear, this is still my house. You work for me, not the other way around. If you can't treat the other employees with a minimum of decency and respect, then maybe it's time we reevaluate this arrangement." The shock on Mrs. Carman's face was visible. In all those years, Michael had never spoken to her like that. He had never questioned her authority. And now he was doing it for some random cleaning lady. "I understand, sir." Her voice came out cold, controlled, but there was venom in her words. Michael left without another word, leaving Mrs. Carman there, seething with rage and humiliation. The house manager knew she had lost an important battle, but the war wasn't over yet, and she wasn't the type to give up easily. Meanwhile, Julia arrived at the school to find Sophia chatting animatedly with the neighbor who had picked her up. The girl ran into her mother's arms, and Julia held her tight, taking a deep breath. "Are you okay, Mommy?" Sophia asked, because she always knew when something was wrong. Julia forced a smile. "Everything's fine, sweetie. Shall we go home?" On the way, on the crowded bus back to the Bronx, Julia looked out the window and thought about everything that was happening. Michael was helping her with Bruno. He was defending her from Mrs. Carman. He was offering hope where there had only been fear. But a part of her, the skeptical part shaped by years of disappointment, wondered how long this help would last. How long before he got tired or lost interest, or realized she wasn't worth all this trouble. Julia didn't know yet that Michael was doing all this not just for her or for Sophia, but for himself as well. Because helping someone was the first thing that had made him feel truly alive since Helen had passed. It was the first time he had woken up with a purpose, the first time the hours had passed, with meaning. It was the first step back to life, and sometimes saving someone is also saving yourself. The restraining order came through in less than a week. Richard Miller worked with impressive efficiency, presenting the judge with all the evidence Michael had compiled. The recordings clearly showed Bruno's pattern of harassment, the repeated approaches, the progressive intimidation. The judge didn't hesitate to grant the order. Bruno was officially served the following Thursday. 2 sheriff's deputies found him at a bar in the South Bronx, handed him the papers, and explained the consequences of violating the order. If he came within 100 yards of Julia or Sophia, if he attempted any kind of contact, he would be arrested immediately. His reaction was exactly what Richard had predicted. Men like Bruno are cowards at heart. They act with aggression only when they're sure there will be no consequences. When confronted with the real possibility of jail time, of legal action, of facing a system that was finally paying attention, they backed down. But Bruno wasn't stupid enough to give up completely. He knew he couldn't approach them directly, but there were other ways to cause trouble, and he knew people who owed him favors, people who did dirty work for money. Meanwhile, inside the Upper West Side brownstone, the tension between Mrs. Carman and Julia continued to grow. The house manager hadn't forgotten the humiliation of being reprimanded by Michael, and in her mind it was all Julia's fault. The attacks became more subtle but no less cruel. Mrs. Carman started spreading comments among the other staff and in the neighboring houses. Insinuations that Julia was taking advantage of the boss's kindness. Suggestions that something inappropriate was going on. Poisonous gossip that spread like weeds. Julia didn't know about any of this yet. She was too busy trying to process the strange feeling of finally breathing without the constant weight of fear. Bruno had disappeared. She hadn't seen him in days. She could walk the streets without looking over her shoulder every second. She could sleep without nightmares of losing Sophia. The gratitude she felt for Michael was immense, but also confusing. She didn't understand why he was doing all this. She couldn't believe that someone with so much money and power would care about the problems of a simple cleaning lady. She was afraid that eventually he would ask for something in return. She was afraid of discovering that nothing in this world was truly free, but Michael asked for nothing. He continued his reclusive life, leaving only for his nightly walks, working from home, avoiding contact with almost everyone. The difference was that now there were moments, brief but significant, when he seemed truly present, as if he were waking up from a very long sleep. Sophia noticed it before anyone else. Children have a sharp intuition for subtle changes in adults. She noticed that when Michael passed through the room where she waited for her mother to finish work, he no longer averted his gaze. Sometimes he even gave a small wave. Once, when she was reading a book about astronomy borrowed from the school library, he stopped and commented on the constellations. "You like stars?" The question took Sophia by surprise. Adults rarely asked about her interests. "I do. I think it's beautiful how they're so far away, but we can still see them." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "My wife liked astronomy too. She used to say that looking at the stars made problems seem smaller." It was the first time he had mentioned Helen to anyone since she had passed. The first time he had managed to talk about her without feeling like he was drowning. Sophia smiled, that small, wise smile that seemed too big for an 8-year-old. "Your wife sounds like she was a nice person." She was. And then, because Sophia had a gift for asking difficult questions in a simple way, she asked, "Are you still sad about her?" "I always will be. But I'm learning that sadness and life can exist at the same time. It's your mom who's teaching me that without even knowing it." Sophia didn't reply, just went back to her book with a smile on her face. Michael continued on his way, but something had shifted inside him. For the first time, talking about Helen hadn't hurt so much. It had been almost comforting. The following week, Richard called with news. He had investigated Bruno's background and found some interesting things. 3 lawsuits for unpaid debts, 2 domestic violence reports from previous relationships that never went anywhere for lack of evidence, an outstanding warrant for unpaid child support for another child he had also abandoned. With this information, Richard scheduled a meeting, not with Bruno directly, but with the defense attorney he had hired as soon as he was served with the restraining order. The meeting took place in a cafe on Madison Avenue, neutral territory, away from prying eyes. Richard arrived with a folder full of documents and an expression that left no doubt as to who held the better hand. The other lawyer, a younger man who was clearly just in it for the money, seemed uncomfortable from the start. "I'll be direct. Your client has an extensive history of child abandonment, unpaid debts, and an active arrest warrant. If he continues trying to extort the mother of his child, I will personally ensure that every one of these cases is reactivated, that every penny owed is collected, and that he spends the next few years solving legal problems instead of creating them." The lawyer swallowed hard. "My client just wants to get to know his daughter. He has a right to that." Richard smiled humorlessly. "Your client wants money, and we both know it. So here's the offer. He gives up all contact with Julia and Sophia, signs documents formally relinquishing any paternal rights, and in return, we don't move forward with these cases. He's free to continue his mediocre life without legal interference. It's the best offer he's going to get." A heavy silence filled the space between them. The lawyer looked at the documents Richard had brought, read a few excerpts, and realized there was no way out. "I'll talk to him." "Do that. You have 48 hours to give me an answer. After that, the proceedings begin." Richard left, knowing he had won. Men like Bruno don't have the courage to face real consequences. When confronted with the possibility of jail, of legally enforced debts, of their comfortably irresponsible lives being destroyed, they always choose the easy way out. 2 days later, the answer came. Bruno would sign everything. He would relinquish his rights, stay away completely. The condition was that the cases would remain on file, ready to be reactivated only if he violated the agreement. Richard called Michael with the news. For the first time in months, there was genuine enthusiasm in Michael's voice when he answered. "So it's over? He's really gone?" "He is. I have his signature on all the documents. Julia and Sophia are safe now." Michael leaned back in his office chair, feeling an immense weight lift from his shoulders. He had done it. He had protected 2 people who needed protection, and for the first time since Helen had passed, he felt he had honored her memory in an active way, by doing something she would have wholeheartedly approved of. When Julia heard the news, she cried. She cried so much that Sophia got scared, thinking it was something bad. But they were tears of pure relief. 9 years of carrying the fear that Bruno would come back, that he would try to take her daughter, that her life could be destroyed at any moment. And now she was free. Truly free. She wanted to thank Michael in person, but he was traveling to Stamford, Connecticut, to deal with company matters he had let pile up for months. So she wrote a letter. She didn't know if he would read it, but she needed to express what she was feeling somehow. The letter was simple, honest, and filled with emotion. It spoke of years of fear, of the strength she had to find to raise Sophia alone, of how he had appeared when she needed him most and changed everything. It ended with a promise that whenever he needed anything, she would be there to repay his kindness. Michael read the letter when he returned from his trip, alone in his office. And for the second time in just a few days, he was able to think of Helen without the pain being unbearable, because he knew she would have loved Julia and Sophia. She would have done exactly what he did. And in a way, by helping them, he was keeping Helen alive through his actions. But not everything was resolved, because while Michael was dealing with Bruno and Richard, was preparing the final documents, Mrs. Carmen was executing her own plan. She had contacted an old acquaintance who worked in another house in the neighborhood. She shared the gossip about Julia, exaggerating every detail, painting a picture of a woman who was manipulating her widowed boss through her daughter. The stories spread. Other house managers heard them. Other staff members commented, and eventually they reached the ears of people Michael knew. It was during a lunch with one of his business partners at a restaurant in Soho that Michael first heard the insinuations. "I heard you have a new employee, one with a little girl." The tone was too casual to be innocent. Michael looked at his partner, trying to figure out where this was going. "I do. Why?" "Just curious. You know how talk gets around. People saying you're getting very close to her, that you're doing unusual things." "What kind of things?" The partner shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I just think you should be careful. You know how it is. A single man, recently widowed, an employee in a vulnerable situation. People talk." Michael felt anger rise like hot lava. "Let me get this straight. I'm helping a single mother who was being blackmailed by her ex, and that somehow turned into something dirty in people's minds. It's not what I think, but you know how it works. Appearances matter." Michael stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. "Then maybe people should stop worrying so much about appearances and start worrying more about doing the right thing." He walked out of the restaurant without looking back, his blood boiling. He called Richard as soon as he got in the car. "I need you to look into something for me. I want to know who's spreading gossip about me and Julia." Richard, ever efficient, promised to investigate. It didn't take long to trace the source of the stories back to Mrs. Carmen, and when Michael found out, it all made sense. The sabotage, the impossible tasks, the growing hostility. Mrs. Carmen wasn't just being cruel. She was trying to destroy Julia in a calculated way. Michael returned home that afternoon with his mind made up. He found Mrs. Carmen in the kitchen, supervising the dinner he never ate. She turned as she heard him enter with the same professional expression as always. "I need to speak with you in the living room." They sat on opposite sides of the coffee table. Michael didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know you've been spreading gossip about me and Julia. I know you're trying to destroy her reputation." Mrs. Carmen didn't deny it. Her face remained impassive. "I was just protecting the house, sir, protecting your reputation. People talk, and I—" Michael cut her off. "You're fired." The words fell like a final sentence. Mrs. Carmen blinked, her mask of professionalism finally cracking. "Sir, I've worked here for over 10 years. I knew your wife. I kept this house running when you couldn't get out of bed. And now you're firing me over an employee you barely know? I'm firing you because you used your position to do harm, because you created a toxic environment, because you tried to destroy someone who had no power to defend herself. That's not protecting the house, that's abuse of power." Mrs. Carmen stood up, shaking with rage. "You'll regret this. When she shows her true colors, when she asks for more and more, when she takes advantage of your idiotic kindness, you'll see that I was right." Michael also stood, looking her directly in the eye. "I hope you find peace one day, Mrs. Carmen, but you won't find it here. You have 1 week to pack your things and leave. I will pay you everything you're owed and provide neutral references. But this conversation is over." Mrs. Carmen left the room with her spine straight, refusing to give Michael the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. But inside, she was shattered. That house was all she had. The power, the control, the sense of importance. And now she was losing it all because of a cleaning lady and her daughter. In the following days, the house underwent a quiet transformation. Mrs. Carmen packed her bags and left without ceremony, leaving only a cold letter thanking him for the years of service. The other staff were shocked, but no one dared question Michael's decision. Julia found out what happened from one of the other employees. She was horrified. She sought out Michael immediately, finding him in his office. "Sir, I heard you fired Mrs. Carmen because of me. You didn't have to do that. I can handle the gossip. Michael interrupted her gently. "It wasn't just because of you. It was because what she was doing was wrong. And because I realized I had let this house be run by someone who didn't share the values my wife and I always held. Values like compassion, justice, and protecting the vulnerable." He paused, then continued. "Besides, I need someone to manage the house, someone I trust. I wanted to offer the position to you." Julia was speechless. "Sir, I have no experience in management. I just clean houses." "You have something more important. You have character. You have empathy. And you have the need to protect your daughter, which means you understand responsibility better than most. The rest you can learn." "But Mrs. Carmen worked here for 10 years. How will I—" Michael smiled, and it was a genuine smile, the first in a long time. "One day at a time. I'll help you in the beginning, and we'll hire other people for the tasks you used to do. You'll be coordinating, not doing everything yourself." Julia felt hot tears stream down her face. In a matter of weeks, her life had completely changed, from a terrified victim to a free woman, from a cleaning lady to a house manager, and all because a grieving man decided that helping someone else was the way to honor the one he had lost. But there was still one piece missing from this puzzle of transformations, and that piece was 8 years old, had eyes that were too big, and a heart that saw things adults couldn't see. Sophia had noticed something that neither Michael nor Julia fully understood yet, that the three of them were, each in their own way, survivors of the same kind of loss. Michael had lost Helen, Julia had lost the illusion that she could count on anyone, and Sophia had lost a carefree childhood by having to grow up too fast. But loss doesn't have to be the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of something new, something unexpected, something that saves not just one life, but all the lives involved. And there was only one step left for them all to realize it, a step that would come wrapped in Christmas lights, the smell of simple food, and the small but powerful miracle of people allowing themselves to trust again. December moved forward in New York with its particular rhythm. Stores displayed increasingly elaborate decorations, the streets filled with people rushing to buy gifts, and a celebratory mood took over the city. But for Michael, each day that brought Christmas closer brought more intense memories of Helen. It had been exactly 1 year since she had passed, on a December morning that felt so distant and so near at the same time. Michael had spent the last 12 months avoiding anything that reminded him of that time. But now, with Julia and Sophia present in his life in unexpected ways, he could no longer run from the memories. Helen loved Christmas. She transformed the entire house into a magical scene, with handmade ornaments, lights in every corner, and always a generous feast where she invited not just friends, but also staff, neighbors, anyone who was alone. She said Christmas was about family, and family was who you chose to have around you. Michael spent a whole week just sitting in his office, looking at old photos of Christmases past. Helen smiling as she hung ornaments, Helen hugging him at the dinner table, Helen handing out gifts to everyone, with that sparkle in her eyes that could light up any room. The tears came, but unlike before, they didn't paralyze him. They were tears of longing, not despair. For the first time he could remember her without feeling like he was drowning, and he knew this change had everything to do with what had happened in the last few weeks. Helping Julia and Sophia had forced him out of himself. It had reminded him that the world kept spinning, that there were people who needed help, that his pain, however intense, was not the only pain that existed. And strangely, sharing the burden with others made his own feel lighter. One evening, 3 days before Christmas, Michael went out for his usual walk and headed straight for the square off Amsterdam Avenue. He sat on the same bench where it had all begun, where Sophia had first found him, and waited without knowing exactly what for. It wasn't long before Sophia appeared, running ahead of Julia as she always did. The girl saw him from a distance, and her face lit up with a huge smile. She ran to him, and without asking permission, sat down beside him. "Hi, Mr. Michael. I just came from the library. I got a new book about planets." She spoke with genuine enthusiasm, without the shyness she used to have with other adults. Michael smiled, realizing this child had forged a connection with him that he hadn't known he needed. Julia approached more slowly, still a bit hesitant to invade his personal space, even after everything that had happened. Michael gestured for her to sit down, too. The three of them sat there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the square fill with evening activity. Sophia flipped through her book, occasionally pointing to illustrations and asking questions that Michael answered with a patience he didn't know he still had. It was Sophia who broke the silence in a more significant way. "Mr. Michael, what are you going to do for Christmas?" The question caught Michael off guard. He looked at the girl, saw those curious, life-filled eyes, and realized he didn't have an answer. "I don't know. Probably nothing." Sophia frowned, as if that were unacceptable. "Everyone has to do something for Christmas. It's important." Michael smiled sadly. "Christmas was always important to me. But last year I lost someone very special around this time, and since then I haven't been able to celebrate." Sophia thought about this for a moment, then took Michael's hand in her small ones. "My grandma died 3 years ago on my birthday, and I thought I'd never be able to celebrate my birthday again because I would just remember her. But my mommy told me something that helped." "What did she say?" Sophia looked at her mother, who had tears in her eyes listening to the conversation, and then looked back at Michael. "She said that the people who love us never want us to be sad forever, that they want us to remember them by doing happy things, not by standing still and crying. That's how we keep them alive for real." The words of an 8-year-old hit Michael harder than any therapy or adult advice, because they came from a place of pure innocence and truth. Helen wouldn't want him to spend the rest of his life locked in an empty house nursing his pain. She would want him to live, to help people, to find joy again, even if it was different. Julia discreetly wiped the tears from her face and spoke for the first time. "Mr. Michael, I know it's not my place to suggest this, but if you'd like, you could spend Christmas with us. It won't be anything grand, just me and Sophia in our little apartment, but it would be an honor to have you." Michael looked at the two of them, mother and daughter, these two survivors who had appeared in his life when he needed them most, even without him knowing he needed them. And for the first time in a year, he felt the urge to say yes. "I'd love that. But on one condition." "What's that?" "That you let me help prepare everything, and that we spend Christmas here. In my house, there's a lot of empty space that needs to be filled." Julia opened her mouth to protest, but Michael held up a hand. "Please, let me do this. Not out of pity or charity, but because you two reminded me of something I had forgotten, that life goes on, and that Helen would want me to go on with it." Sophia jumped for joy on the bench, and even Julia couldn't hold back a genuine smile. There was the change. There was the new beginning. Not erasing the past, but integrating it into the present in a way that honored the one who had left. In the 3 days leading up to Christmas, the brownstone on the Upper West Side underwent a transformation. Michael, with the help of Julia and Sophia, began to decorate in a simple, meaningful way. Lights in the windows, a small tree in the living room, ornaments made by Sophia with paper and glue. With each ornament hung, Michael told a story about Helen. Sophia listened to each story with rapt attention, and Julia noticed how Michael was healing with every word. Talking about Helen no longer destroyed him, but reconnected him with the good memories. On Christmas Eve, Julia arrived early with Sophia and a bag full of simple ingredients. They had agreed to make dinner together. Nothing elaborate, just roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a salad. American comfort food, homemade, made with love. Michael hadn't cooked in over a year, but there he was, peeling potatoes next to Julia, listening to Sophia talk about school, feeling alive again. While the food cooked, the three of them went into the decorated living room. Sophia snuggled up next to Michael without fear, and Julia sat in a nearby armchair, watching with a smile. Michael looked around the room. The lights twinkled softly. The small tree shone in the corner. Laughter echoed off the walls for the first time in 12 months, and he realized something fundamental. The house was no longer silent. It was no longer empty. It was no longer frozen in time. The pain of losing Helen still existed. It always would. But now it shared space with other things, with gratitude for having known someone so special, with the purpose of honoring her through his actions, with the small but real joy of having people to care for, and who cared for him in return. Julia watched Michael with an admiration and affection she didn't yet know how to name. This man had saved her life and Sophia's, restoring her faith that there was goodness in the world. And Sophia, with a wisdom only sensitive children possess, understood that she was witnessing something rare. Someone coming back to life, choosing hope over despair. When dinner was ready, the three of them sat at the kitchen table. They didn't use the formal dining room with its mahogany chairs and expensive crystal. He preferred the simple table where he and Helen used to have breakfast together on weekends. Michael served the food carefully, each plate an offering of gratitude. Julia blessed the table with a simple but sincere prayer. And Sophia, ever the observer, commented that this was the best Christmas dinner she had ever had, even though it was the simplest. During dinner, they talked about everything and nothing. Sophia shared her plans to become an astronomer when she grew up. Julia shared memories of the grandmother who had raised her and who had left a huge void. Michael talked more about Helen, about the dreams they had together, about how she had made him a better person. And in the middle of that simple conversation, around that humble table, with homemade food and open hearts, Michael realized something profound. He wasn't betraying Helen's memory by moving on. He was honoring it. Because Helen had always believed that love shouldn't trap people in the past, but propel them into the future. After dinner, they exchanged small gifts. Sophia gave Michael a drawing. Michael gave Sophia a children's telescope. And Julia gave Michael a framed photograph. But the greatest gift was the transformation that had occurred in all three of their hearts. Michael learned that it's possible to honor those who have passed without being consumed by grief. Julia learned that kindness exists and that she deserves dignity. And Sophia learned that small gestures can change destinies. As the night wore on and exhaustion began to set in, Michael insisted that Julia and Sophia sleep at the house. There were plenty of spare rooms, all clean and ready. Julia hesitated, but Sophia was already half asleep on her feet, so she accepted. She settled her daughter into one of the guest rooms, a cozy space with a soft bed and sheets that smelled of lavender. Sophia fell asleep in seconds, hugging her new telescope as if it were a teddy bear. Julia went to another room, but before going to sleep, she went down to the living room where Michael was still sitting in the dark, watching the tree lights blink. "Mr. Michael?" He turned, saw Julia standing in the doorway in a borrowed robe, with an expression that mixed gratitude and something deeper. "Just Michael is fine. I think we're past the point of formalities." She smiled and entered the room, sitting in the armchair. "Michael, then, I want you to know that you've changed my life, and Sophia's, in ways I'll never be able to thank you for." Michael shook his head. "It was the other way around. You two showed up when I was drowning in sadness. You reminded me that the world still needs people willing to help. You gave me purpose again." A comfortable silence filled the space. Then Julia asked, "What happens now, after today?" Michael thought about it. There were so many possibilities. They could go back to the previous arrangement, boss and employee keeping a safe distance, or they could acknowledge that something had changed. that they had become something closer to family than any professional category would allow. Now we continue. You continue to take care of the house, but as a real manager, with a fair salary and respect. Sophia continues to come over whenever she needs to, and I continue to learn how to live again with your help. And what if people talk? If they think it's strange? Michael shrugged. Let them talk. I've learned recently that the opinions of strangers matter a lot less than the peace of mind of those who actually matter. Julia smiled, relieved. She stood up to go to bed but paused at the door. Merry Christmas, Michael. Merry Christmas, Julia. Michael stayed there a little longer after she went upstairs. He looked at the tree, at the ornaments Sophia had made, at the room that for so long had been just a mausoleum of memories. And for the first time since Helen had passed, he could imagine a future that wasn't just about survival. He imagined Sophia growing up, visiting him on weekends to look at the stars through her telescope. He imagined Julia becoming confident in her new role, maybe even taking courses, expanding her horizons. He imagined himself going back to work for real, connecting with friends, participating in life again. It wouldn't be easy. There would be hard days, moments when the longing for Helen would be unbearable. But now he had something he didn't have before, reasons to keep going, people who depended on him, people he had learned to love in different but no less real ways. On Christmas morning, the three of them had breakfast together. Simple pancakes, brewed coffee, orange juice. Sophia told him about a dream she'd had. Michael shared plans to renovate the backyard. Julia suggested planting flowers that would attract butterflies. After breakfast, before Julia and Sophia left for the Bronx, Michael took out something he had kept for a year. A small wooden box where Helen kept special letters and photos. He opened it and showed it to Sophia. These are memories of my wife. I want you to have some. Not to replace anything, but because she would have loved knowing that a smart, kind girl like you is learning about the stars. Sophia took the photos reverently, looking at each one carefully. There was one of Helen as a young woman, smiling at the camera, another of her pointing at the night sky during a trip, and a handwritten letter about dreams and hopes. I'll take very good care of them. I know you will. When they finally said goodbye at the front gate, there was no sadness, only the certainty that this was a beginning, not an end, that they would see each other again soon, that their lives were now intertwined in ways that transcended simple categories of boss and employee, of helper and helped. Michael stood there watching the mother and daughter walk to the bus stop, and felt peace, not the absence of pain, but the coexistence of pain and hope. He went back inside the house that was no longer a tomb, but a home again. He went up to his office and opened the drawer where he kept the last photo of him and Helen together. He looked at her face, at that smile he knew so well, and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to love. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that honoring you doesn't mean I have to stop living. It means living better. I'll take care of them, I promise, just like you would have." He put the photo back, but this time he didn't lock it in the drawer. He left it on his desk, visible, a part of the present, because Helen deserved to be remembered not with darkness and silence, but with light and life. In the months that followed, the lives of the three continued to transform. Julia thrived in her new role. Sophia excelled in school. And Michael began to participate in the world again, taking back the reins of his company and reconnecting with friends. And there were always those moments in the park, once a week, where the three of them would meet on the bench where it all began. Because in the end, living isn't about forgetting those we've lost. It's about honoring their memory through every choice we make. It's about transforming pain into compassion. It's about using our own experience of loss to protect others from suffering alone. Michael learned this in the hardest and most beautiful way possible, and in the process, he saved not only Julia and Sophia from their own abysses, but also himself. Because sometimes when we reach out a hand to save someone, we find that we are saving ourselves too. And so in that Upper West Side brownstone that was once a tomb and became a home again, three souls found what they needed. Not perfection, not the absence of pain, but the courage to continue, the strength to choose hope, and the wisdom to understand that true love never lets anyone suffer alone, even when it comes from the most unexpected places. Life went on. The seasons changed. Christmas came again, year after year, and with each celebration, Michael would light a special candle for Helen, thanking her for everything she taught him, including and especially the final lesson that to truly love someone means letting them go when it's time, but never stopping to live the way they would have wanted you to. With Julia and Sophia by his side, Michael finally understood that family isn't just who shares your blood, but who shares your heart, and that new beginnings, however painful, are always possible when we find the right people at the right time, or maybe when we allow ourselves to be found. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Michael, Julia, and Sophia has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of resilience, loss, and new beginnings, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of the story resonated with you the most. Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and show that, even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. We'll see you in the next episode.